Hail to the chief, he's the chief, and he needs hailing. Welcome, one and all students and teachers, and those of you who have maintained a lifelong curiosity in the American Constitution, to episode 5 of the Constitution of American Life with us, the Friends of Publius. Tonight, we are going to be discussing the issue of representation, more specifically, the structure of legislative assemblies and the debate in the revolutionary constitution making period over unicameral versus bicameral representation. If you haven't noticed, as we are here on episode 5, there seems to be a consistent theme, intentional or not, to have students comment on small d democracy. So far, we have dealt with Socrates, Plato's disdain of direct democracy, Mercy Otis Warren's complaint about the lack of small d democracy, and Alexander Hamilton's distrust of the common man. In this episode, we join with Hamilton, the voice of John Adams, see irony on that one, who seems to share the same view about the nature of man and the capacity of people to self-govern without rigorous guardrails. We are honored once again to have with us the Commander-in-Chief of the Center for Civic Ed, Christopher Riano. Welcome, Professor Riano, to our program.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here.
And I hear that you've been on the road an awful lot, got yourself out of the great state of New York, and brought yourself to another great state, I think, California. Here, you getting any sun rays?
Oh, no question. It's much sunnier here. That's an easy one, dude. That's a very easy one.
I think we're second behind Florida in skin cancer, but it's still enjoyable nevertheless there. So I do have to mention that last fall we had Professor Riano with us to talk about the privileges and immunities, and it is the most viewed episode in the history of the Constitution and American life. All right, more people, logged on or I forget the term, but latched onto that episode than any other episode we've done. So no pressure, Professor Riano, but we are expecting similar ratings from tonight there. So let's begin by sharing the words of John Adams, which lays the foundation for student testimony on unicameralism versus bicameralism here. John Adams observed that unicameral legislatures were subjects to fit of humor, starts of passion, flights of enthusiasm, partialities of prejudice, and consequently productivity of hasty results and absurd judgments. And then the students and teachers are asked to deal with what examples from the revolutionary period would have led Adams to such a conclusion. So let's begin, as we've done this season, by asking our Friends of Publius and our wonderful guest, Professor Riano, what their first gut reaction was when they saw the question. What first jumped out at them? So, Professor Kavanaugh, when you saw this question, what first jumped out at you?
Geez, I was hoping you were going to Tim first. I think that understand. No, I mean, I obviously understand you're going to really have to channel your inner historian on this question, I believe, especially in the beginning of the root question. What was going on during the Constitution making period in the very, very, very young states as they're making that switch from colonial government to state government and constitutional government, and take a look to see what has been said there. There's a lot been said and a lot been written about the benefits of bicameralism over unicameralism. So I think that this is very much a historical question. That's why I was hoping you were going to Tim first, because he could actually speak more eloquently on this. But I think it's really important.
But we're on the clock, so that's why I'm going kids first.
Jump in at 1776 and go forward in the constitution making process to see what the debates were at the state levels, because they're simply going to bring up whether it be British government or other colonial governments as well. So,
Professor Williams, what jumped out at you?
Well, I agree with that, but I think that teams can do their bit towards history and then get into the actual fun stuff to think about presentism, right? And, seriously, to have an eye towards what were the founders, what problem were they trying to solve with bicameralism? And then to the second bullet point, it says, has it functioned the way founders intended? That allows you to think about the challenges and issues today about the House and the Senate, and to think about, are they the same issues that the founders were thinking about? Has it changed? And to what extent does bicameralism address those issues that we have today with government? So it is a history question, but I also see a lot of current issues that can be brought up to think about it as well.
Professor Riano.
I actually really like how that was framed by everybody so far, because I think in many ways it creates a dichotomy that I don't even really think exists historically. And I think you can actually start to look at what's happening at the time that things are kind of crystallizing in our experiment here with the Constitution. And you can see that there are people experimenting in many different ways when it comes to the creation of legislative authority, right? And I think that it's important always to take moments of time and think about what's happening historically. So I couldn't agree more with the history point. But to do so, I think it's most creative as well as helpful to do that in order to then switch that to, okay, so how has that turned out? How does that look big picture? We definitely have talked previously about the 50 laboratories of democracy that exist here, and then the 51st, right, the federal democracy laboratory that we look at. How does that really function? And I would say this, I challenge folks right from the get-go to see this as a binary, because I don't think it is historically. And I think that's something that we can end up talking about further this evening, because it's not an either or. I think it's actually a lot more interesting than just that when you actually do pick apart the history of what's happening at this period of time in world events.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, my first reaction is this is classic Adams. I mean, he's the old guys in the Muppet. They're up in the box.
Frumpy.
Yeah, I forget their names, but I mean, he's.
I think they're called Tim and Dave.
But this is classic Adams in his grumpiest self. But the other part of this is, my first thought was, students need to pay attention to Tom Paine, because Thoughts on Government is in many ways a direct rebuttal to Paine's. There's two consultants, so to speak, in the mid 70s. We're in 75, 76 states were told to write constitutions. And so they're looking around for local folks. What kind of advice would you give us in setting this up? So there's this Adams view, and then there's this Paine paradigm as well. So that was my first response, that this quote is in the context of a rebuttal to Paine.
So I want to start with you, Professor Moore, and this is dangerous ground for me because, as was said, I think our last session by Mr. Kavanaugh, I take very simplistic approaches to certain things here. But my first response, as I looked at this, was that kind of doesn't really matter. That if, and it's a big if we take Madison seriously in Federalist Paper number 10 on the discussion of a large republic, if we do, all right, I know that's debatable. My sense is if you extend the republic, all right, and provide the filters to enlarge and refine, does it really matter whether or not you have a unicameral legislature or a bicameral legislature?
I think it does. And I think the writers going back even into antiquity, the Romans had a system where there was multiple cameras. Harrington, I think in his piece Oceana, made this eloquent argument for this. There's a necessity for two houses. You've got Montesquieu references the need for. At the Continental Congress in 74, they were wrestling with how states would vote as the revolution was unfolding there in 74, 75. They revisit that issue in 76 in the Continental Congress. There it was directly about representation, but they were dabbling with the idea of upper and lower house. Adams is not happy with how the Continental Congress is functioning. In a sense, the Continental Congress is, it's it's kind of a constitution unto itself, because there is no constitution. They're writing the articles, but there is no constitution. So he is not happy with how the Continental Congress is operating as a unicameral thing. Now, he later is not going to be happy with how the articles as a unicameral legislature is not functioning as well. So I think the historical writings are all there that this two-house approach is good. That one house is unstable. So that's deep in the writing that bicameralism is.
And I understand my sequence is problematical because Adams is writing in 1776, Madison is 1788, and the Federalist anti-Federalist debate. But to me, it seems that Madison is addressing possibly.
Oh, sure. And there are factions. Oh, there are definitely factions within the Continental Congress. I mean, there's a great book about the factions within the Continental Congress, all the way from early 70s of the first Continental Congress, all the way through under the Articles Congress. So Adams knows that there's factions. So I know that your questions, we're fast forwarding to Madison, but there are factions in that Continental Congress that Adams is very aware of.
Okay, so Professor Riano, again, doing what little research I did, it's 1776. All right, and this is where I got a little bit confused about the question and what Adams is referring to, because the state constitutions themselves, they begin writing them in 1776 as he writes his thoughts on government. There's two states that have unicameral systems, and that's Georgia and Pennsylvania. So since I know nothing about Georgia, I'm going to ask, what in the HE double toothpicks is going on in Pennsylvania that gets Adams panties in a wad?
Well, I think that once again, I think what Tim and the way that Tim has set this table is the real big picture that we have to think of here. And coming right back to this historical question, I actually think that you can make an argument that even as you can have a unicameral or bicameral system, you're actually really looking at, in many instances, viewpoints that even go beyond that already in the history of the colonies turning into states, as well as the federal system. Let me use an example. If you were to traditionally look at the state of New York, you would say we have an assembly and a senate. So you would normally just sit there and say, all right, that's bicameral. That's actually not completely accurate, because there are things where the legislature in New York actually will sit, and I would argue in a tricameral fashion, as a super legislature to do certain things that they've been doing since before the state became a state. So, for example, electing the regents has always been driven as a tricameral process. And if we think about this, and somebody here keep me honest on dates, because I'm not always 1,000% good on dates specifically, but if I remember correctly, as you finish writing the U.S. Constitution, that's framed in very much in part looking at this legislative power question, and you have President George Washington inaugurated on April 30, 1789. 5 days later, May 5, 1789, you have the final General Assembly in France, which is a tricameral assembly, had been for hundreds and hundreds of years. Not saying it's effective.
The Estates General.
Well, and yes, so and then it's not saying that was effective. In fact, the revolutionaries started then, but think about that. That's why I think we have to push this both historically, but also today. New York still elects its regents in a tricameral fashion. At the moment, they're thinking about how do you distribute legislative power? And the Estates General didn't even distribute legislative power very well, obviously. I'm only pushing this to say this because I think this is actually very important from a contextual standpoint. I don't think we can think of this answer as one or the other. I think you have to look through the history, the very long history of how Parliament developed in the United Kingdom, some of the real questions that surround that Parliament and the growing power of the Commons and how that looked versus the House of Lords. I think you have to think through how that might frame itself post Articles of Confederation, where they were thinking about how do we actually set these power pieces in motion in a way that might be successful. 1789, there's no amendments yet, right? If I remember right. So I think you're just looking at the original 7 articles and just thinking about how that's going to operate. So there's a lot of questions, not just about the positivism of the creation of the words on documents, and not just about the arguments of the various different systems that might exist, but there's a lot of questions about, well, if we don't necessarily know how this should look at a federal system, and we do have some laboratories that are looking at this in a more unicameral way, or at that time, again, I can make an argument for New York. I think that's the framing that we have to think through for a question like this, because I'd be the first to argue that, yes, you set up a bicameral system at the federal level. That bicameral system has changed significantly in the last 250 years, and not because the words in Article 1 changed. It's because of the way we've looked at it. And I think that is a piece of the puzzle that we always have to come back to when we're looking at the larger scope of legislative authority, because legislative authority also bleeds into other places too. So long answer to what I would argue is not this binary that you can talk about and think through a binary, but the reality is this is much more interesting historically when you get into. That's why I think it's so important to have that history to talk about how that looks in a contemporary fashion.
Well, Pennsylvania is stuck in his craw because it's the worst. Look, they got a couple things going on in Pennsylvania that Adams absolutely abhors. Yes, the unicameral legislature he doesn't like, but the politics in Pennsylvania, every year, the constitutionalists are voted out, and the party called the Republicans are voted in. The constitutionalists in Pennsylvania love the Pennsylvania Constitution, and the Republicans hate it. Every year, there's these tremendous whipsaw changes in policy in Pennsylvania. That's especially problematic if it's a unicameral legislature with these tremendous changes of policy. He doesn't like the Council of Censors. So there's some things going on in Pennsylvania that he sees as really troublesome that might have been cured with a bicameral approach. So there's some local politics in Pennsylvania that really is stuck in his craw.
Well, and it's amazing, Tim, because what you just identified, I think, is so critical to think through, right? We now in 2023, have the ability to have technology that would allow for all of us to sit around every Friday and vote. Could we not vote in a very direct way when it comes to thinking about policies that would impact the federal level, state level, et cetera? But I always impress upon students, there's a pretty unique downside and a lack of stability that would come from being able to have those changes every Friday. And you have to think through those kind of pieces of the scale. And Tim, you've hit the nail on the head. One of the things that dispersing power does is it attempts to find ways to create that stability while still allowing for those inputs that create that representative format of government.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, any insights? I guess one of the things I'm wondering, and it seems so there is an issue with Pennsylvania, and I guess possibly Georgia. Tim articulates there's also the Continental Congress. Do colonial governments have any role, to the best of your knowledge, Chris, in some of Adams' perceptions here about unicameralism?
Yeah, Massachusetts, good.
Yeah. What Tim just said. Yeah, Adams, as early as like 1772, he's ripping on, these places. We don't even have state governments yet, and he's saying that things like the best governments of the world have been these mixed governments. that you can find in Greece and Rome and Carthage. But you also see that at the colonial level. You see this bicameralism at the colonial level. And I think, honestly, I think, and Tim will correct me here, I'm sure, but I think what's in their most immediate view is Parliament. And they see Parliament as a House of Commons and the House of Lords, which the landed aristocracy that you would have, or the titled nobility that you would have in Great Britain. Obviously, we didn't have titles of nobility here, but we have people with property and we have people with money, and somehow they're maybe better than others, and they should be in this higher this higher body within the colonial legislature. So I do think that students need to pay attention to what's going on at the colonial level before we get into that constitution writing period of 1776 and 1777.
Chris's comments made me, there's this weird passage in later writing of Adams' defense of American constitutions. He makes an argument that we need an upper house because we can effectively isolate rich people and stick them there in the upper house, and they can't do significant damage because there's bicameralism. So we can isolate. I mean, what a great argument, huh? Put the wealth. It's almost a fait accompli that there will be wealthier people in the upper house. So fine, put them there and isolate them so they can't do any damage in the lower house.
Well, this leads me to ask, and Mike, I'm hoping to hear for you. One of the books that I read in college is, how revolutionary, was the revolution. And I look at this, and it seems that we pretty much adopt, the British system when it comes to the legislative branch, pretty closely. Because in the last analysis, whether it's the state of Massachusetts, who gets to serve the Senate in the state of Massachusetts, and who gets to serve at the national level in the Senate, that it is this landed aristocracy designed to temper, the passions of the so-called democratic institution. So I'm just wondering, is this bicameralism really, kind of a push against the revolutionary elements of 1776? Does that make any sense to anybody? Or, Chris, you're nodding. Thank you. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Yeah.
I mean,
thanks, Mike.
I mean, I think we've said on here numerous times about, the revolutionary ideas get tempered in the Constitution when we actually think about governing. And I would agree with everything that's been said here. I think Christopher mentioned the importance of stability, right? And this notion of, it hasn't been articulated this, but, in the Constitution, our senators were elected by state legislatures. They were meant to represent state interests because we are a product of 13 different political cultures. So I think that origin point's important. And I think it's also important just to raise the issue of slavery and the issue of, you could create an upper house and make it more majoritarian, but our upper house was created in a way to make sure it was anti-majoritarian in terms of that slave states could effectively stop, right, what non-slave states were going to be able to do during those first few decades. So I think all of that points to kind of, as you said it, Dave, kind of an anti-revolutionary kind of push. They want stability. They want to slow things down. They want the people to be heard, but they don't want to be too responsive, maybe because of what they've seen in Pennsylvania and what they experienced in the Continental Congress and the Articles.
I want to push back a little bit, David.
I hope so.
Yes, we accept in form the British system, but there's just so many differences in how that upper house. I mean, they're not they're not hereditary. Yes, state legislatures select the senators, but that's very different than how you got to the upper house in Parliament. These local shires don't pick folks to the upper house in Parliament. So I think there's enough differences in how representation works, how you get there, that it's not just a British system implemented. I think it's, I would say it's, I don't think it's revolutionary, but I'm saying it's not as British, I think, as you might have poked us with.
Well, let me ask.
I'm gonna be really stupid here and disagree with Tim on this. I do think if you look at what was being written at the time, the model that is being held up is the British system for the creation of the Senate as we know it. They people throughout the 13 states at that point are saying, well, we don't necessarily have titles of nobility, as I alluded to earlier, but we do have a natural aristocracy. And I mean, so I'm just saying,
and that's not different than the British aristocracy.
Well, what is our natural aristocracy? Those are rich people, right?
Landed.
It's not necessarily you don't get it's not like you're getting a grant from the king or the queen or the sovereign.
Yeah. Yes, there are wealthy people, but I mean, some of these cats are not real wealthy that are in these upper houses and state legislatures, or the first Senate, for that matter.
Okay.
I mean, Charles Beard aside here.
Well, I guess, Chris, would it be accurate to observe, because here's my historical reading of bicameralism, is that it leads to a less responsive government. Tim was saying that, well, let's create this Senate because they can't do any damage. But if it's truly bicameral, and I'm sure Professor Riano might clarify this but if it's truly bicameral, it's gonna in many ways repress democratic impulses and the popular will of the people there. So is it accurate to say that bicameralism leads to a less responsive, meaning i.e. responsive to the people kind of government, at least as originally set up?
But that's not a bad thing. I mean, I would say, God, I got to check myself on this. That's not a bad thing, though, because if you have this unicameral legislature with no check from a separate chamber, that popular will, as you guys have already alluded to, that popular will can change quickly. And I think Christopher's the idea of every Friday we get together and, hey, what do we want this week? Oh, I don't know. What tickles your fancy? So I think the idea of a bicameral, yes, let's hope so, is going to tamp down the popular will as it's designed to, right? Which is not a bad thing. Does it make it less responsive? Yes, but the hopes is that it makes for better legislation.
Well, okay. How's that worked out for you?
Oh, you can't do that. You can't do the presentism yet. You can't do the presentism yet, David.
Yeah, well, David, you know very well how that has worked out for me and my views. But I think at the time frame, if you look to what is being written by people, again, up and down the 13 states, and you see it represented in most of the states, 10 of the 13, I believe, they believe this is the best way to diffuse power.
I have an empirical historical question for y'all, because what examples would the students have of, in the first 20 or 30 years of the nation, things that were passed by the House that the Senate then didn't go along with, that we might label as being too democratic? I mean, do those examples exist in terms of the Senate serving this function of slowing things down, or not? Because then we don't get in the presentism. We can just see if it happened in the moment.
In the early national period, that's a great question, Mike. All right, so Tim, Professor Riano, do we have? I mean, I think it's a good thing. What examples can we refer to in the so-called early national period? That gives us substantive, evidence to use of, okay, it worked out as a way of the Senate to temper, all right, the democratic impulses. Anything in your heads there?
Well, it's complicated by the fact that there's not a rigorous second party objection to a lot of legislation coming out of the first Congress too. So it's a bit, I'm not going to use the word dishonest, but it would be hard to parse that out because the hardened opposition to the Federalists hasn't occurred yet. Now there are the Senate wants to curb and modify some of the Bill of Rights discussion as it moves over into the Senate. That might be a good example of him, kind of putting the kibosh on some of that. But I would say the lack of a hardened party resistance may complicate the answer to that, Mike.
Okay.
It's interesting. That's really Tim, that's very insightful, because that's very true. I would also agree that the early Uniparty system would have made that less likely in some ways, but I think you might see, and I don't want to say the Senate necessarily tempering the House, I want to say bodies tempering each other. When you look at the first amendments, there were many, many more amendments, and there were amendments to weave the amendments into the original document. And I'm sure if you were to go back, and I'd have to go back and look, but there's definitely temperance going on with the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights doesn't look like it was drafted. It's actually pretty significantly different in some ways. And so I'm sure you can probably see some of that. I'm just trying to think of something very early on where I'm sure that the bodies were back and forth.
Yeah, the assumption bill got a lot of some blowback on whether the national government should assume state debt. So that's going to rattle and hum in the Senate.
Well,
Tim, rattle and hum in the House too. But the assumption bill, the funding bill, the bank bill. But again, I think the lack of a really stiff party resistance. My hunch is it's not there, Mike, but I'm not certain.
I just throw out a counterfactual, and I don't know. I'm just pulling this out of my ear. Could the way the Constitution is to be ratified, right? And we are not going to go to state legislatures, because we know we're going to have to go through, if we go through state legislatures, we're going to have to go through, in 10 of them at least, 2 chambers each. And that is going to be too arduous. It's going to be too difficult. So let's go to ratifying conventions. So I don't know if counterfactual is the right term, but if it's showing the purpose at the state level in these bicameral legislatures by making it harder for them to agree, because if they're all of a similar mindset, you could just send a constitution to state legislatures and have them ratify. But they just, one of the reasons
I tend to look at it as I don't think there's any great theory involved in that move.
Okay.
I just think it's we don't want to get bogged down in 22 cameras. We just don't want we don't want that, because the Federalists know the more entities that weigh in on it, the more difficult it is. So I don't see a great the way I read it, I don't see a big theoretical or philosophical principle there. I think it's just a matter of expedience.
Okay.
It's interesting, because if you look at the only other amendment that passes via ratification, it's done so because they want to do it so quickly.
Yeah, right.
and boy, did that go fast. Woo, that went very fast, because people were like, they wanted that 21st Amendment in the Constitution. They wanted to get rid of the 18th Amendment.
Yeah.
So, Professor Williams, I'm kind of curious on this notion of, is bicameralism looking at, again, the so-called democratic world? All right, is bicameralism, the norm? Is it the global norm? How do other nations in the world, taking an international perspective, deal with this notion of a legislative structure and democratic government?
Okay, yeah, the number that I found in the research is about 2/3 of world governments are unicameral. I don't have that breakdown by democracy, but looking at the list, it seems to hold that most democracies are unicameral. In fact, I can point the student teams to New Zealand as an interesting case. In 1951, they voted and changed their constitution to go from bicameral to unicameral. So we definitely are in the minority. But usually there's an alignment with the bigger your country is, the more diverse your country is, more likely you are to have an upper chamber.
Size matters.
It definitely does, and different interests matter too. Like, in terms of if you think about the 13 colonies as 13 separate political cultures and political entities, there's an argument that the Senate is necessary to accommodate those different interests. So, but in terms of having bicameralism is unique, and in the way our Senate works in terms of 2 senators per place, that's also unique. And Robert Dahl, in his book "How Democratic is the American Constitution," it's 2 of his big data points about how undemocratic or anti-democratic the Constitution actually is.
Well, can you give me some insights on Senate structure or upper house structure in some other nations? How do they do it? Is
Sure.
it just proportional?
Yeah, it's proportional based on size. A lot of them continue to do what our original Constitution did, where it's through the state legislatures that people are chosen. Because again, the idea there, I think in theory, is that if you have an upper house and you're going to give representation to states or provinces, it's because you think that there are interests in the states and provinces that are important enough to be heard. I had a professor in law school who used to argue, shouldn't we have an upper house that's made up of urban interests? Like, doesn't that make more sense in today's world in terms of wanting more voices around the table? Wouldn't you do that around cities rather than around states? But that's just not the way we did it at the beginning.
Any questions or comments to Mike's insights, gentlemen?
Well,
I'm surprised. It's that's amazing to me. 2/3.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
So is that just another example of America not being able to export certain elements of our Constitution?
Well, assuming that we're destined to export.
Well, I think if we get in the world of American exceptionalism and the narrative of America's role in the world.
I mean, but the United States has the oldest democratic constitution in the world, and obviously it was ratified at a time where there was this mistrust of small d democracy. Most other constitutions in the world are so much more recent, and there's been I don't know if there's the experience has taught us that maybe we shouldn't feel threatened by small d democracy, but in terms of getting things passed, you'd have to set up systems that are going to be more responsive to people than our current system is, just by virtue of the time period they're being ratified.
Professor Kavanaugh, you were going to say?
Oh, I was just saying, going by what Mike said about urban representation coming from a small population state, and having this discussion with some of my fellow North Dakotans and folks from Wyoming, that they wouldn't like that idea of setting up urban representation.
Why? Chicago can represent your interests.
Yep. And me personally, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but you're going to get some pushback from some people in some more rural.
Well, and Mike, I think you know that. Christopher. I mean, the whole relationship between New York City and upper state New York is I think a wonderful example. California, because I mean, you really have New York. Not that you don't have other large cities per se, but with California and the Bay Area, Los Angeles, and its tension with areas. But in New York, it really is kind of a binary thing. Am I right? There's New York City, and then there's the rest of the state.
Oh, and I think in many ways, it's one of the great things I love to show folks is that, New York City is New York City. It is a global city unlike anything that humankind has ever really created before. And it's an incredible place, but New York doesn't work without Albany because the state constitution makes it so. And so right now we're doing our annual budget process, And the city never likes that because the city has to go up, and we call it Tin Cup Day, and go with their tin cup to try to get the money from Albany, because that's how this works. And that's just how it's designed, and has been designed for a long time. And having my family come from upstate, I'm the first that will say that you've got to learn how to balance those things. And Dave, I think you hit the nail on the head. When you have states that have those differing interests, especially with the population centers that exist in some places, it's shocking in some ways what would be the difference between the day-to-day impact of or day-to-day life of a Chicago alderman versus a U.S. representative from Peoria. And I'm only using another state as an example because I think it's only fair to see that exists across the country. And that's actually one of the most amazing functions of this experiment, is that we've been able to make that work for so long.
Well, I'm curious, how does the upper chamber, or the Senate, as they call it, it's the Senate, right? How is it designed in New York? And what I'm curious is, New York is considered such a blue state, but it seems to me, well, New York City is blue, but you start getting up to Albany, and my mother's family is from upper state, Utica, that area, it ain't that blue, so how does New York get called a blue state when I'm assuming the Senate representation has to be predominantly outside the city of New York?
And especially if you look historically at the history of the state, it's actually quite rare to see both chambers at the moment represented by the same party. In fact, it's actually not been like that in recent history. And I think that's in many ways because of the difference that exists between and in fact, it's a lot like if you go all the way to North Country, it is not that much different than a lot of other places that are great in the rest of the 49 states. New York City is actually the outlier. There's just no other urban amalgamation that has the number of people that exist in the United States that New York City has. There's just nothing like it. And so not only with the tri-state issues that come up, right, because New York City really is a New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey entity, but then you've got all the questions that come from Long Island. You've got all sorts of things that come from the Hudson Valley. I mean, it's one of the great things that I think actually makes New York so fascinating, is that it does function. And those are words you could put in quotes, but it does function somewhat well, considering the incredible amount of government that is required by the state constitution to operate. And it's a lot of government every year that's required to operate this state.
Well, and I contrast that to Wisconsin, because it's different, but there's some similarities in the sense of Milwaukee, and help me out, Tim, but I don't know to what degree Madison as well. But the politics in your state in the last 10, 15 years has changed drastically.
Oh, sure.
And
and we, in our legislature, the Republicans control the upper and lower. So there's tremendous headbutting between the state legislature and Madison as well.
Can I ask how that is? Because aren't Madison and Milwaukee your two largest population centers?
Yes.
So how is it? How is it in the design of the Wisconsin bicameral system that that they don't have more representation?
Quite effective gerrymandering. I don't have, me and well enough to know I don't have many axes to grind in terms of policy, but I do. It's a remarkable thing that the Republican Party has done in the state of Wisconsin to effectively ensure that both houses are Republican, even though they don't get a majority of the votes. It's just unbelievable success story in state gerrymandering.
So is New York trying to take some lessons from Wisconsin, Christopher?
You can look at the last election cycle, the last redistricting cycle, and see that the districts of New York were written by a master in Binghamton, I think, right outside Binghamton. So if you want to think about the way that democracy functions, and you just told that about 9 million people in New York City that their districts for the assembly, I think they're redrawing the assembly districts now, the Senate districts, the congressional districts were all drawn by somebody up in Binghamton. I mean, that's the reality of 2022 in New York. And I think that that's fascinating to see when you think about how the idea that you place that decision with representatives, it can be really, really moved around depending on how politics can play into those questions.
I'm just curious to either of you, and I'm sorry, Chris, CC, North Dakota, do you have a population center?
Actually, we do. We have the east side of the state, Fargo and Grand Forks, which are very closely related to Minnesota. And the very few Democrats that we have in our state legislature usually come from those areas. Obviously, we have a state legislature that's dominated by Republicans, being a rural state. I shouldn't say obviously, but it's kind of what we have. But the folks from the population centers of Fargo and Grand Forks tend to be a little bit more Democratic, big capital D Democratic, because we also have two universities. We have the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks and North Dakota State University in Fargo. Bismarck, the capital, we are the fourth largest city, I believe. We tend to be still pretty conservative here.
Well, I'm wondering, Christopher and Tim, you know, if there's any movement in your states to do what California did, and that's an independent commission, because I think there's an intricate relationship between legislative, bodies and how they represent, and obviously, as you said, the gerrymandering and the drawing of districts. And Mike might want to jump in here. My sense is it's worked out pretty well, the independent commission in California.
We do have an independent commission.
But wasn't there something funky with that?
They may or may not have come up with, if I remember, was it map A and map B, or map 1 and map 2, and they deadlocked. And so it went to I think, in fact, it went to a tricameral legislature. It may have gone to the full entire legislative body, and then it got booted out in court. And then it turned, I mean, I do truly find, and I only use New York because I not just know it so well, but I find it absolutely fascinating how many ways you can design government. There are right now we're doing our budget process, and the governor gets to write all the legislation that goes with it. So she's legislating the spending of the next $220 billion next year in New York, which can include long-term projects. I love how that's possible because I find it fascinating that you can structure these things. And just thinking about the big picture of what our conversation is this evening, it's why I really do emphasize that you've got to see these things in the bigger picture of how they're designed. And it is not necessarily as simple, because the US Senate's not functioned the same throughout its history, right? You have the 17th Amendment, which was really an anti-corruption amendment because the state legislatures were electing these really interesting senators that were really just patronage individuals in many cases. And that wasn't the best thing maybe for the upper house at the federal level. That's what makes this so fascinating, is you can take what we've put together. You can take, as Mike pointed out, how the rest of the world has different ways that they look at this. But the reality is that you have to take the structure, and you also have to take how the structure is enacted in order to best understand how this all actually plays out, which is how you can have an independent redistricting commission in New York that.
Yeah. Tim, you did this when I said that.
No, we we wound, I think, in the U.S. Supreme Court over our maps, and the court, Supreme Court said, yeah, they're fine. So I think that's going to put the kibosh on any aggressive movement in terms of getting better districts drawn in Wisconsin for a while.
Mike, I'm curious. Do you think California's system's working?
Compared to how it was working, yes, I think we're getting much more elections.
Yeah, your signal's kind of going in and out again, Mike. So we got to get to presentism, although we've kind of been dancing around it here in this last discussion. So Professor Riano, to me, clearly the goal of bicameralism was to temper the passions of the more democratic unicameral systems and build in more stability at the national level. In your view, and again, you're a professor, you've taught classes, how's that played out in American history? What grade would you give American bicameralism here? Again, has it achieved the goals that it set out to achieve? I guess that's the best way to present it. And
I would be thrilled to have the opportunity to hand out a law school exam question with the one way that we do this, which is like these one sentence questions to every single member of the legislature that says, what grade do you think you should give yourself and why? Here's 3 hours. And I say that because I think actually it's a great question insofar as, let's use this as a contemporary example. We have this vision of the advice and consent of the Senate for appointees that's radically different in the last 60 years, 70 years. Tim, you probably could keep me more honest. There was never what we see today when it came to advice and consent and confirmations. It's just completely different. Did the words change? I always come back to that. No, right? It's our norms that have changed. And I think coming back to something that Mike, you brought up earlier, norms make a big difference because norms are actually what allow unicameral systems to function, because they come back to certain guardrails that exist, written or unwritten, that will prevent certain boundaries from being crossed, so that the norms that exist and the history that exists maintains the institution's functioning. And different places look at that different ways, right? And that's okay. It's a good thing. And I come back to that because I think that that's actually very enlightening when we think about the fact that, especially now, we do pick the folks in our legislatures directly. Generally speaking, maybe there's a place that we don't still, and that's possible. But in some ways, this comes back to a conversation we've had before, which is, again, drawing these lines between how do you draw representation versus democracy, and how do you want to balance majority rules versus minority rights. And I don't think that there are perfect answers to that. But ultimately, we do retain the power as the people to elect the people into these positions that are making some of these decisions. And I think it's through knowledge, insight, and inquiry that we can really have an impact on them being responsive to us as those who are being represented by the folks in various different branches of government. And I think that actually shows why this may have changed over time. And yet also, because it's changed in the past, can always change again in the future.
So you're the CEO of one of the leading civic education programs in the United States. So it seems to me, based on what you just said, in order for this to work in the most effective way, the citizenry has to have knowledge about legislative districting and stuff. Yet it seems to me most citizens just have no clue. So are we just doing a really bad job in the field of civic education and educating our citizens? Yeah, I know that was a
I mean, that could both be the easiest and hardest question at the same time. But I actually think that that's really what it says, is that we require in our society a understanding of being involved in our civic life and our civic institutions, and in being civically engaged in all sorts of ways. That's actually that's in so many ways a systemic creation of how this was designed to function and how it does function. And again, that's not necessarily calling your city council person, although that's a thing. Like, you should know how that works, and you should know. I always ask often at the beginning of class, who is your state assembly person? And I am always shocked that nobody can answer me. That's a good thing to know. You should know more about that than tweeting or posting certain things that aren't going to have that same impact on one's life. But this is also a society based on our civil institutions. So this is why it matters that people participate in things like the Rotary, or I'm an Eagle Scout, so the Boy Scouts of America. These things are the fabric that tie us together, and these are the ways in which we impact our communities, which impacts the larger community, which impacts the society at large. So I think in many ways, I think that's what we all do in the civic education space, is we're trying to give people the tools to know this background, know that maybe it's not as simple as bicameral or unicameral, know what the world does in many of these instances, know why it's developed to where it is today, but then also know how to have an impact so that we keep going towards something I always like to say, which is the very beginning of in the preamble of a more perfect union, right? And that's why this matters. It's because we're still going and attempting to go that direction, but it requires people to know how we go in that direction. And whether that's in Bismarck or New York City, or in the great, great city of Albany or Sacramento, that is really at the heart of trying to really understand how these decisions get made and how we can have an impact in these decisions.
All right, set up for you, Kavanaugh. A grade for bicameralism. Did it achieve? Has it achieved the goals that they may have had when they set this, or sent this out to the world?
Oh, geez, A++++.
The cynicism is just dripping from your mouth there. So go ahead, expand on that,
because
please.
because clearly they wanted to slow the passions of the people, and I don't think we can get any slower than what we got right now. So yeah, so I mean, but honestly, I say that somewhat tongue in cheek. Is come back to your previous question to me, David. Is like that was the whole goal of dividing power, right? And so much was written, as the students hopefully realize, that so much is written about, the accumulation of power into one spot is a very dangerous thing. So let's divide it up as much as possible. We're going to divide it up, horizontally as well as vertically. We're going to divide it. The legislative power, we're going to take the legislative power and we're going to divide it into this bicameral nature. We're going to divide it in a system of federalism. So that, the whole purpose is to make sure that no one group gets too much power, because we see that as a detriment and it can become abusive or tyrannical. And so in regards of slowing things down, I would say we've been very successful. And does it make it less responsive? Yes, it does, as it was designed to do, to make it less responsive, or to cool let's go back to Washington's description of the cup and the saucer, right? The passions of the house, it's a hot coffee, and what do? You take it and you pour it from the cup of the house, and you pour it into your saucer, which is the Senate, to cool it, because now you have this natural aristocracy, people to consider larger issues, or maybe from a different viewpoint from the passions of the house. So I would say it's done exactly what it was designed to do, and that was to check abuse of power.
So, Professor Williams, do you share my feeling that, that's an 18th century, a construct, makes sense in the 18th century. I don't know to what extent it makes sense today, given that one of the biggest contributing factors in poll after poll or study after study that I've been reading on the rising frustration levels with our system of government is its non-responsiveness and its lack of speed, to address problems. Do you agree with me there on Mike, or on this, Mike, that that maybe we need to think about the construct which was developed in the 18th century in an agrarian society with no modern technology, that maybe we need to come up with ways to adjust to the 21st century?
I do, but someone correct me on this. Isn't the Senate itself, it's the one institution that the Constitution says cannot be amended? Is that right?
Only with the consent of the states.
Yep.
Right. So, I think the student team should think about that. And again, so yes, David, our norms are different than they were when the Constitution was ratified. And part of my analysis of American politics today is that there's a growing disconnect between our small d democratic values and our anti-democratic institutions. That definitely there was a reason, and that served a purpose, and it may continue to serve a purpose. The question is, how long does a society go being unsatisfied with the way democracy works? And in a previous episode we shared, I think only Italy is more dissatisfied with their political system than the United States right now. But we are kind of stuck in this box because the amendment process is so difficult. And I don't, there are some things we could do. Anyways, so yes, I would agree with you. But I don't know the way out necessarily out of the structural problem, because it's the one thing in the Constitution that without the consent of the states can't be changed, and that's just not going to happen, right?
Right.
So
yeah, they guaranteed that. So as always, time is an enemy for us, and so as we tend to do, I asked you at the beginning to give a gut kind of sense of the question. And I'm wondering, or I'd like for you now to provide insights and recommendations to students and teachers as they work through this question. Some things that maybe from the conversation, if any way you've, we'll just leave it at that. So, Professor Moore, what insights and recommendations would you give to students and teachers on this question?
Well, I got thoughts. I don't know whether they're insights or recommendations, but I would say this: as we've been talking, I've been jotting a few things down. And one of the things we've been talking a lot in the last 15 minutes about frustration. I'm always intrigued by when somebody shows up in the House and wants to alter the committee system. Occasionally you'll find a senator talk about maybe we need to change our internal rules of how we do business. So I guess a recommendation I would have to teams is, analyze the bicameral piece in this question. But I would recommend for your consideration that really good teams are going to know about the internal operations of the Senate. I mean, things that aren't in the Constitution, but they've defined as how we're going to do business. Well, some of them are ridiculous. And the power of the House Ways and Means, the Rules Committee. So I think teams should know more than just bicameralism. Maybe some information about how the internal policies of each of the houses operate. And that just kind of came to me as we were talking about frustrations, because I think some of those internal operations within those houses contributes to that frustration that we might have as citizens.
Chris?
I'm actually really curious as to how some of the best students in the country, when they grapple with this question about perhaps suggesting changes, because this is always a we the people kind of thing. If it's broken or if it's not working, how would you fix it? I answered your question, David, with A+ because it's doing exactly what it's designed to do. And I agree, it's not responsive to the people. So I'm really curious about how the future leaders of our country will come up with suggestions on how, if it's not working properly, how we should change it or how we should tweak it. And I would encourage the students, don't be afraid to throw out things that you think are radical. Because in essence, if you think about our founding fathers, they truly were radical at the time as well. And they saw problems and they thought, well, let's make radical changes to address these problems. If you believe that we have problems today, think about radical changes, but be prepared to defend those. So I'm very curious to see how some top students in the nation wrestle with this presentism aspect of this question.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I would recommend, and Dave, you did a good job of prompting the students on this, to know your state and to know your state's bicameral system. And teams from Nebraska and Maine, I believe, can talk about their unicameral systems. Because I think there's an interesting discussion there. To what extent have the states just copied the federal blueprint without really thinking through whether it makes sense at the state level? And so I would think about that. I'd also think about the comparative example. I mentioned New Zealand. I think it'd be really interesting. New Zealand had a constitution they adopted from Britain in 1834 that was bicameral. In 1951, they went unicameral. I don't know, you could use Google and kind of see what New Zealand newspapers are saying about why that change was made, and ask yourself, is New Zealand today a tyranny that's run by, masses who are just taking freedoms away? I think I think that's relevant to kind of provide some perspective on the debates that we've had, how the system is working, and then moving to what possible other reforms there are. And I just want to add one more thing, because I was just thinking, we don't have bicameralism at the city and county level. I mean, wouldn't that sound kind of like crazy if I said, I think San Diego City should have an upper chamber and a lower chamber for the city? So I just wonder to what extent states are just playing copycat and it's not really serving the function other than giving more people places to go serve in politics. So I'll stop there.
Professor Riano.
I think what you've heard from everybody here tonight is why my favorite class almost always to teach is a class on comparative jurisprudence, where you teach Locke, Rousseau, and the history and kind of the background of the development of what the law is, but then you use it as a lens to compare and contrast constitutional systems over history and time. Because I think what you're hearing is that by having those tools, you're able to start to make some calls as to, well, this worked here, maybe it wouldn't work here. Mike, you just said a great example. We don't have bicameral city council legislatures, but we do have these interesting mayor-city council relationships that can exist. I mean, that's kind of fascinating when you kind of start to think about what these bodies do. And I think it's through that analysis, that comparative analysis, that you can start to pick up on not just how things may have changed, again, just from a democratic norm standpoint, because we've changed the way that we're thinking of things, but also, well, if they're doing this here and maybe they're doing this here, maybe there are pieces that we can think through and learn about, because the states have done things differently over time and the federal government has done things differently over time. One only needs to look north to the very interesting system that Canada has, where just even looking at comparing probably one of our closest neighbors, they have a vastly different way of thinking about the Constitution and how you can suspend written parts of it for periods of time. And I mean, just look at what their Supreme Court looks like. I mean, it's incredible how our neighbor to the north operates in this in their own constitutional historical kind of landscape. And then one only needs to look to where we came from, Great Britain, to realize that they still have an unwritten constitution. So this is fascinating. It's the comparative analysis that gives us insight and allows us to think through how we can make things better, maybe what's worked, what hasn't worked. And it's why I find this exercise itself, what we just did, so incredibly fascinating and wonderful as constitutional scholars. This is the exciting stuff. There's other exciting stuff too, but this stuff is really, really interesting because you don't have to accept at face value necessarily that there's only one way to do it.
Well, and to echo that, I just want to close by saying that I think Professor Williams' question, when I judge, I tend to, I want to assess, that founding framing period. I want to make some judgments there, and I want some evidence. And I think Professor Williams' question, and maybe we can expand that era, the 1789 to 1860, of some examples of where the Senate was able, or played the role it was intended to play vis-a-vis the House. I think that would make some really strong testimony. As always, we hope that we have given you some things to think about. We hope we have given you some nuggets to possibly build upon, and we look forward to continue to do that. We want to thank the CEO, the Center for Civic Ed, Professor Riano, for joining us once again. He's somewhere on the road in America. It must be California, given the artwork on the wall there. So yeah, I don't know if you'd find that in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
That was very good, Dave. That was very good.
Thank you. I took an art class once. I got a D-, but that stands for diploma. Let's just remember that, okay? Kind of stuff. So thank you, Christopher, for joining us. Next session, we're going to be hopefully either talking about separation of powers or American foreign policy. We haven't decided yet, but we look forward to continuing our conversations. Until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye, bonds.